Hello and happy Friday. This is Mrs. Kelsick, and this is the lesson for March 11th, 2016. As you know, I will not be here today, so I wanted to make sure we got a lesson in about 3.06 Folk Music Part 2. You'll notice our objectives for today is trace the development and historical significance of folk music in the United States from the early 19th century through the 1930s. Explain historical and social context of folk music revival in the United States. Explain the importance of protest music. That's important, guys. And explain musicians in the second folk music boom. So we're going to start here. We had talked last semester about minstrel shows and how it presented Black American music accurately or with dignity. So in 1871, someone did present the Black American music accurately and with dignity, and that was called the Fisk Jubilee Singers. Fisk University opened in Nashville, Tennessee in 1866, and this was after the Civil War. It was the first American university that was open both to black and white people, men and women, which is really significant, and had a choral group named the Nine Fisk Students, 7 of whom were former slaves. And they began to travel around the country and singing slave songs. And when we talk about dignity and respect, this is the first time Americans would hear African American music presented in a respectful manner that wasn't racist. These Fisk Jubilee singers met with both acceptance and racism everywhere they went in the United States. Fisk students still perform as the Fisk Jubilee Singers even today, as 130 years later. So, folk music and how it changed the world. So we have, like we talked about yesterday, we have the first folk music boom with artists like Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, and the Almanac Singers. But a major part of history and the story had nothing to do with music. It was about the discussion of folk music and the discussion about society, and what brings one up important element of folk music is politics. So the early part of the 20th century, people were different than they are now, especially poor people and African Americans, because they had segregation, which obviously is wrong. There was no minimum wage, so people could pay you whatever they wanted, and there were not a lot of unions, which protect workers. There was no welfare, so there wasn't any food stamps for people that needed that. There was no Medicaid. There was no safety net for people that might lost their jobs. And a lot of American cities had ghettos where there's poverty, disease, and they were widespread. In factories and mines all over America, mistreatment of worker was common. Now remember, because there was no unions, so there was no one to protect these people, and there was no minimum wage, so people could be working really hard for not a lot of money, even though we know that people do that today still. So it was a very hard life for anyone that of color or for poor people. So then we have this leftist and social causes, which people on the left kind of saw social issues as a battle between the folk and big business. We kind of see this today, don't we, guys? In a battle, they saw folk music as something that could really rally people around them and unite them for a great struggle against the rights. So people like Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie and those Almanac Singers would appear at union meetings, labor rallies, and fundraisers, strikes, and sit-ins. So I want you to think about this now. This music was a form of music. It was called protest music, so they were protesting what was going on. But the events that these people attended drew a lot of attention from folk music, but also branded of folk music as leftist for many people. It didn't help that people in the center of the attention were strongly associated with communism. And what communism is a school of political thought that was considered unpatriotic, treasonous by many Americans. So turning the traditional folk song into a protest song. So you'll notice here, sometimes folk singers wrote new labor-oriented lyrics to old songs. So Kentucky songwriter Jim Garland started the traditional song with a greenback dollar with the original verse. I don't want your greenback dollar. I don't want your watch and chain. All I want is your heart, darling. Won't you take me back again? So Garland turned it into this. I don't want your millions, mister. I don't want your diamond ring. All I want is the right to live, mister. Give me back my job again. Remember, it all goes back to a lot of people didn't have jobs. There was a lot of very poor people. So obviously, I hope that you've learned about the Great Depression, and that was in the 1930s when everything went crashed in the United States. And to Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger and lots of other people, they were concerned about this. And it's easy to see why. Because to them, communism seemed like the only system that would lift poor people out of poverty and ensure that everyone was treated fairly. But people on the other side of the political spectrum saw communism as evil and dangerous to the United States. So when we got to 1940, these leftist folk singers were no longer sure about communism. So this is where they started changing their minds. But they still believed, and this is important, in helping workers and poor people. And they began to doubt communism was a solution. But at the same time, the Soviet Union was only a communist country. So the more people found out about life in the Soviet Union, which was not great, the worse communism seemed to be. So by the 1950s, all these folk singers kind of had changed their tune. And what the Red Scare was a fear of communism spreading throughout the United States. And we don't need to know a lot about this, but just know that it was fueled by Joseph McCarthy, who was a senator. And the whole story of Joseph McCarthy is really upsetting. If you want, you can go online and Google it, but you're not going to really need to know it for the test or for the quiz. But during this time, if people thought you were a communist, they would blacklist you. So folk singers like the Weavers, including Pete Seeger, had turned away from communism, but members avoided political songs in their concerts and concentrated on folk music because they were afraid of being blacklisted. But there were still most popular music groups in the country, but they were still accused of being subversive. So Seeger was blacklisted, and all the Weavers were followed by the FBI. They lost their concert bookings. Radio stations stopped playing their music. Record company dropped them. They were disbanded in 1952. So I want you to think about this. Do you think that musical blacklisting could happen today? So after all that, then we're going to get to the second folk music boom. And it was still protest music. So folk music had a very popular resurgence in the 1960s, and it became associated with politics and social issues. So from like 1955, 1965, the United States had the civil rights struggle that still continues today. But in 61 to 1975, the United States fought the Vietnam War. And I'm sure you've all heard of the Vietnam War. And as in the 1930s, people in folk music community became very involved as advocates of civil rights, not only for African Americans, but to protest the war. So we have now second boom folk singers like Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Tom Paxton would sing at marches and sit-ins, voter registration drives, and protest rallies. Folk musicians wrote and recorded protest songs, and if you click right here, it says protest songs, songs written to say what is wrong and sometimes recommended solutions. So it would say, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is how we could fix it. So folk music would record these protest songs, and sometimes they talked about peace and freedom, justice, being kind to the environment, and racial inequality. Some other people were more specific. And yesterday we actually listened to a Bob Dylan song, Like a Rolling Stone. So back when all this was happening, it was a pretty troubling time, not only for folk singers, but rock bands and just people in general. They would join protests against the Vietnam War. College students at this time were especially active because what you probably know already, but at this time, young men had to register for the draft. And just if you didn't know what the draft was, it was a process to select young men for service in armed forces. They didn't have enough people in the armed forces, so they would give everybody a number, and if your number was drawn, you were enlisted in some of the military forces. And then that way they could go to Vietnam to fight. And if they agreed with it or not, it was their duty to their country at that point. The civil rights struggle and protests against the wars kind of split the nation. So you either had people for the war or against the war. But they weren't only problems that the country faced, because following the lead of Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger and others, musicians addressed painful national events in their songs. Crosby, Still, and Nash and young rallied against the Kent State killings in Ohio. And I am a graduate at Kent State. And, this is 40 years after, and it's still very fresh in the mind of people at Kent State. They actually have a little monument in the parking lot where this happened. If you're not sure what the Kent State killings were, I encourage you to read about them. But also, here we go, Marvin Gaye, which we learned about in the Motown unit, wrote a song on war, poverty, and drug use. On that album, again, remember that album, What's Going On? What's Going On? Remember that song? Okay, songwriters would use these styles ranging from rap to heavy metal to continue to write about current events and problems following the footsteps of the earlier folk singers, like an earlier folk singer like Woody Guthrie. So here's a picture of people protesting. There's the White House, and this is against the Vietnam War. You see right here, it says, "No more, stop the war." So the story continued with civil rights, wars, politics have always been big themes in American folk music, but other topics now, religion, geography, and history have as well. Folk music has been a natural way for people to share their ideas on what's going on in the world. The good thing about folk music is not too complicated. It's kind of easy to create, perform, and listen to. As we listened to yesterday, the melody was very catchy and repetitive, and people could remember it pretty easily. No one would mind if you borrowed a melody from one song to another. If you take the song about love, change the words, and make it a song that complains about pollution, poverty, or war, that was what folk music was about. In fact, there's a good way to learn to write songs. If you take the subject you care about most and write a folk melody and sing it to a folk melody, Woody Guthrie would do the same, did all the time. So he would borrow a melody from somebody and then put words to it. So if you want, you can go to Unit 3, 3.06 Music Part 2, and learn folk music and society, and there's this checkpoint. Folk music is a music of ideas. Many folk songs, as we learned, had large social impacts on the politics of the time. Complete the activity, and here is the activity, and you can do that on your own. So when you get to the end of the lesson, obviously you're going to have this 3.06 quiz. Make sure you take the quiz. The quiz is due Friday, March 11th, but it will be open for a few extra days. You can use this video. You can use all the resources in the lesson itself. In addition, remember we always let you take the quiz twice. So in case you weren't sure, we have 3.04 quiz due, 3.06 quiz due, and the midterm exam due, as well as this weekly exit ticket right here. So make sure you take some time today to make sure you've covered all your bases. That midterm exam is really important. And so are the 2 quizzes and a weekly exit ticket. As always, if you have any questions, you can contact me or you can contact Miss Williams, and we're here to help. Good luck. Have a great weekend.